Deng Xiaoping came in. And here, Deng set up special economic zones on the coasts, prices were liberalized, and firms were allowed to optimize, and they did. Energy intensity in China improved greatly over the next 20 years until about the early 2000s, where we see this next little blip up there. Although that looks small on this chart, because the Chinese economy had been growing at double digits for decades, it had huge implications. And so taking a look at what caused that little blip is crucial to understand the kind of energy demand in China today. So as the trends of globalization and Deng's reform kind of met, export-oriented economy created a huge demand for labor, and hundreds of millions of migrants from the inland provinces came to the coasts to work in these factories. It's been, I think, 300 million urbanized Chinese since 2000, just massive amounts of people. And these new urban Chinese were also fairly young. So China was riding this, you had this demographic tailwind. You notice that kind of bottomed out in 2010. This is the dependency ratio, namely how many dependents each number of per 100-age working population has. And China's now going into some demographic headwinds as it gets older. But these new urbanized Chinese, they need buildings, they need roads, they need public transit, all of which require huge amounts of cement, steel, flat glass. And this is the story of Chinese energy demand. And although that flip that we were talking about in the previous slide looks super small, it had huge ramifications. This economic restructuring had huge ramifications for Chinese energy demand. This chart, as you can see in the pink line there, is the IEA's forecast for China from 2002. This was based on continual energy efficiency improvements that we saw in the first chart. But after this urbanization boom hit and China started producing all this cement, iron, and steel, the IEA revised its forecast up by 80%. This is a huge structural change. And this bears out in the energy data itself. This is total primary energy broken out by sector. So a couple of key things about this chart. First off, over 70% of Chinese energy demand is in industry. And within that industry, over half has been in essentially 5 sectors for Canada. Namely iron and steel, non-ferrous metal products like aluminum, non-metallic mineral products like cement and glass, chemicals and coking fuels, which you can lump into the iron and steel sector. And this is what drove unprecedented growth that the world has never seen over the last 10 years. This energy, as we all know, was fueled largely by coal. In the upper 80% used to be. Last year's total primary energy demand was 64% powered by coal, which has huge environmental consequences. As we all know, China has some of the worst air in the world. In 2013, premature deaths from PM 2.5 were up around 900,000. These are huge numbers. It's a huge drag on the economy, and there's starting to be real political forces, both with civil society as well as a burgeoning middle class, that is resisting against this. This is Chai Jing. She is a journalist who produced a documentary called Under the Dome, which got like 300 million views on Youku in a week before the censors shut it down. This is a very real issue in China. And so this kind of growth, this industrial-led growth, has been environmentally unsustainable. However, it is also economically unsustainable. So this chart shows the growth in GDP versus PPP GDP per capita. So what it's basically saying is no country can grow at double digits forever. What has to happen is a transition into you kind of have two choices. Japan, Taiwan, and Korea made a transition to lighter manufacturing and eventually into services and consumption. Some Latin American countries, like Mexico, failed to make fairly painful policy reforms and ran right into the middle income trap. That's the green line down there. And China, with roughly $10,000 GDP per capita currently, is facing this choice and has a lot of tough reforms that need to be made in order to avoid running into this middle income trap, this hard landing. My colleagues in Rhodium produced a study a couple years ago called Avoiding the Blind Alley, and they outlined 9 bins of reform that the Chinese government needs to make in order to avoid this hard landing. And I won't read through all of these. I encourage you all to go look at the study. We're tracking these to kind of get progress indicators. But the one reform I would like to highlight is kind of the reallocation of capital. Because of that urbanization boom, because of the huge value from the industries that fueled that urbanization boom, China has had a large bias towards infrastructure investment. And lately this has not been returning the same amount as it once did. This is the Chinese economic slowdown. So what China needs to do is reallocate that capital from unproductive sectors, like iron and steel, into productive sectors, like services, like healthcare. There is a car commercial a couple of years ago that talked about when this car hit ice, it would transfer power from the wheels that slipped to the wheels that gripped. China needs to do something equivalent. It needs to transfer power from the iron and steel sectors into the service sectors. And this has huge implications for energy demand and the environmental consequences of that energy demand. The good news is that if China wants to what China needs to do to unlock the next 10 years of growth will also reduce, growth in energy demand and the associated environmental consequences. For every million RMB you invest in iron and steel, you get it requires about 40 times as much energy and only provides about 1/3 as many jobs as every million RMB invested in the service sector. And so we'll take a look at the energy data here. We can see some of this slowdown actually happen. This is year-on-year growth for Chinese primary energy consumption. Last year it was the slowest since the Asian financial crisis, which suggests the returns on China's current investment in some sectors is not going as well. Taking a look at specific fuels, it also reflects this general slowdown. Electricity was down 1.6%. Coal demand was down hugely, almost -4%, and both oil and natural gas slowed from fairly aggressive growth rates. But looking specifically at fuels and sectors, we can see kind of a little bit of the two stories going on in China. One, the economic slowdown, but the other being some rebalancing occurring. So this is the electricity demand broken out by sector. Overall, it's down, but this is largely, almost exclusively driven by the industrial sector. The commercial and residential sectors, strongly associated with the service economy and consumption, were both up, had fairly robust growth. This is also reflected in oil demand. Fuel oil and diesel, both industry associated, were not doing a whole lot or down by double digits, whereas gasoline, for passenger cars and the new kind of urban economy was up by double digits last year. So some evidence of rebalancing. So where this kind of leaves us is the key question. The China team at Rhodium Group has done some, using their progress indicators on the reform bids that they're tracking and come up with some sort of estimates for future Chinese growth. Currently, the best case scenario, Chinese cumulative annual growth for the next 5 years will be about, 5%. And the associated energy demand, fuel that growth, is probably a 1 to 2%. On, the downside case, which seems ever more likely as China fails to kind of implement some of the necessary reforms, GDP growth could be as low as 2 to 3% with an absolute reduction in energy demand, which is, kind of going back to the IEA chart, maybe another kind of huge shift in how you need to think about future Chinese energy demand. And yeah, so I'll close there. Perfect. And just would like to, this changes kind of how one needs to think about what Chinese energy markets hold for the next 5 years. It'll be, not this huge growing pie where everyone can get a piece. It'll be fixed or shrinking, and that's means very different energy and environmental policies than have been previously used in the past 5 years. And with that, pass it on to my next panelist.
Thank you, Peter, for a great exposure to the ideas. Our next speaker is Kate Gordon, and when you look at bio in the presentations that you have at the moment, there are a few things that come out right away strong to me at least. She has been focusing on green jobs movement. In my research, what we found out that every fourth job is water dependent. That is a big number, I never knew about that. But this is very important to find out from her what is the impact of all the policies on jobs. But ultimately, what everybody wants, and if you have read the quote from the CEO of the Aleppo, this is there is nothing more important to the human being or the human civilization. Not religion, not nation, nothing. No jobs. Jobs are the key, so I was glad that you will talk about that. And she has worked currently she is at the Boston Columbia University as a vice chair. And prior to that, she also has worked for Center for American Progress and also part of the National Apollo Alliance. So she has a variety of background and experience. We're looking forward to hearing from her. Okay. And also she is going to moderate our post-discussion question and answer.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you all here. Thank you to the organizers. And I should say, the Paulson Institute, where I am a vice chair, is actually based at the University of Chicago. But I'm also proud to be a fellow at Columbia's CEPA school. So part of the organizers of this conference, I'm happy to be here representing Columbia as well. So you have had, I think, a lot of, sorry, grabbing this. Here we go. You had a lot of discussion this morning about the Paris Agreement, and you just heard Having give more context, and you know that this is a critically important set of policies. The U.S. and China, as the largest emitters and largest economies, are a key piece of this and have both, of course, ratified the agreement, which is amazing. And one of my fellow panelists, William Friedman, said that I think 60 countries as of today have ratified, which is big. However, Paris doesn't, it's great news. It sets a very, very important global market signal on the need for an energy transition, which is mostly what I'll be talking about. It doesn't get us where we need to go, but it's, as this slide shows, but it's extremely important in setting that market signal. The intersection of markets and the economy and climate and energy is really where the Paulson Institute sits. We are wholly or very focused on this issue of what will it take to do a transition, to have an effective transition to a clean energy economy. I think you talked this morning Someone brought up my boss, Hank Paulson's op-ed on green finance in the New York Times. Of course, finance is one of the key drivers of that transition. But so are other areas, technology, which Julio, I think, will be talking about, policy, which I will be talking about a bit. But to me, the real issue is, when thinking about a transition, is an economic development issue. When you think of a transition at this scale from one type of energy to another, you have to ask yourself, not only where do we want to get, which is really what the Paris Agreement is about, but also where are we starting from? And I'm going to talk about two areas that get to that question. Two areas where China is, one where China is trying to get, and one where China is starting from, that offer opportunities but also challenges in the clean energy transition. The first thing that I'm going to focus on is where China wants to go in terms of switching to new energy sources that are less carbon intensive and less energy intensive, and that's, of course, renewable energy. I'm actually going to show a video, which I hope works, in just a second. It is actually narrated in Chinese, and the subtitles are in English, but this is a video that we at the Paulson Institute put together to try to explain to non-expert audiences this very important issue of renewable energy curtailment, wasting of renewable energy within the utility system. And any of you who have ever worked on power sector reform know how hard it is to explain the utility structure to anybody, let alone non-experts. But this video tries to do that, so I'll switch to that and we can start it.
2022冬奥会只有6年就要到来，北京和河北张家口承诺举办绿色奥运，任务艰巨，但主办城市已为备战冬奥制定了雄心勃勃的绿色规划。张家口风力资源丰富，是中国第1个国家级可再生能源示范区。张家口的绿色规划是，到2020年，55%的电力将来自可再生能源，2030年将提高到80%。北京的绿色规划是，到2020年，电动汽车将增至60万辆，充电桩43.5万。可是，尽管中国的风电装机容量在全球遥遥领先，但气风量也居首位。即使是风电充沛的张家口，也面临同样的困境，存在传输规划不合理、可再生能源定价不合理、不被优先调度等问题，大量风电只能放弃。而另一方面，北京却在用高污染火电给电动汽车充电。或许京津冀地区可以借鉴一下国际经验。德国及美国德克萨斯州，他们的总电力需求量和京津冀相当，可再生能源的发电量比京津冀更大，而气风率却只有1%。力学是传输电网合理规划，可再生能源大范围优先调度，定价合理。德国每年25%的供电来自风能和太阳能，并且气电率只有1%。德克萨斯建立了可再生能源配电专用线路，气风气光率急剧下降。如果张家口可再生能源示范区能扩大至整个京津冀地区，并如法炮制，就有望实现可再生能源全部上网，真是风光无限。这样，张家口富余的电力就可以给电动汽车充电了。北京、张家口，蓝天在线，绿色冬奥不再遥远。
They did a nice job with that. You can actually find our paper on this subject and that video on our website if you want to watch it over and over again. Dance around your living room to that song. But what you heard here is not just an issue for China, although it's a particular issue for China. It's an issue for the world as the world tries to make this transition. And that is that you can build all the renewables you want and put all kinds of ambitious policies in place to become what China is today, which is the world leader in solar and wind capacity installation and investment. But you need to actually use the energy. coming from those renewable sources, or else you've sort of defeated the purpose, not only of changing over your electricity system, but something that many of you in this room care about, having electric cars be actually greener than current cars. China is leading in the world on curtailment and has the opportunity to learn from other places, but also to lead in this area, because addressing curtailment could actually make a huge difference in China. Curtailment issues or wasted renewable energy is as high as 40% in some provinces, and in the wind energy sector in particular, this is leading to an economic loss for China of something around 16 billion RMB. So, in fact, since we made this video, the curtailment rate has gotten worse, and is now went from 15% nationally, which is what we say here, to about 21% nationally in the first half of 2016. So addressing curtailment, as we talk about in the video, we talk about in the paper, is a real opportunity for China not only to catch up, but also to lead globally on something that is a global issue: power system reform, efficient dispatch, and use and really efficient use of renewables. We talk in the paper about, here again is the slide of China kind of leading in curtailment. We talk in the paper about Germany and Texas as potential models for China, or for the Jing-Jin-Ji region of Beijing, Hebei, and Tianjin in particular, which is on sort of a similar geographic scale in terms of the population center distance from where the renewables are being produced. And we have some specific recommendations which kind of range from technical to policy recommendations, but they start fairly obviously from just coordinating national goals like the commitment to Paris, the INDC, the goals of renewable production, and the goals to decouple economic growth and carbon emissions from what's actually happening on the ground in terms of transmission planning and dispatch. Too often, we see it here in the United States, we see it in China, we see it everywhere. The national environmental and energy goals are decoupled from what's actually happening from grid producers and providers on the ground. So those two things need to be coordinated. We also talked about establishing a timeline to reduce curtailment, doing spot market pricing. So instead of setting a fixed price for renewables coming into the grid through a feed-in tariff that will sometimes artificially raise the price of renewables, counterproductive policy, actually setting spot market prices so that renewables, when there's a lot of wind or a lot of sun, the price of renewables is competitive, and just fixing the dispatch system. Right now, there are actually existing monthly or sometimes even annual contracts with coal generators in parts of China that are prioritized over bringing renewables into the grid. These are all solutions that are, again, applicable in China but applicable globally. And to your point on the introduction, building up this kind of a renewable infrastructure that actually helps, and building up the grid infrastructure to go with it is a major job creator. This is essentially a massive infrastructure project, but new infrastructure instead of sort of the old infrastructure that you just heard me talk about. The other area that I want to talk about, and actually Keith's presentation set me up very nicely for this, and I think we have very similar slides, is this question. I talked a minute ago about where does China want to get in terms of a new energy economy. In order to get somewhere, you have to be honest about where you're starting, and where China is starting is with an extremely industrial economy. You've heard me talk about this a little bit. China's CO2 emissions are largely from the industrial sector, and the industrial sector is critically important to clean up in terms of its contribution to emissions and air pollution, but it's also not easy. The industrial sector is, first of all, an economic driver. Pete set this up nicely, but this has been the underpinning foundation of China's growth in the last several decades, and it is the backbone still of the global economic system. Heavy industry, steel, is 80% of each of those wind turbines. You just saw the happy wind turbines in that video.